Welcome back, Jules. I'm your host, Jade, and as always, before we begin, grab your scuba gear because today we're diving into some deep water. This isn't the kind of conversation that's meant to point fingers or place blame. It's the kind of conversation that asks us to look beneath the surface of the lives we've lived, the homes we grew up in, the families we love, and the experiences that shaped us. Some of you may find yourselves agreeing with what you hear today. Others may feel challenged. Some may even feel uncomfortable. That's okay. Growth often begins with discomfort. My hope isn't that you leave this episode choosing sides. My hope is that you leave this episode choosing healing. Today, we're talking about something that has quietly existed in families for generations. It's passed from one generation to another, sometimes intentionally, often unintentionally. It's defended, minimized, explained away, and in many cases, even celebrated as just how families are. Today, we're talking about normalizing trauma. Now, before we go any further, I want to make something very clear. This episode is not about attacking parents. It is not about encouraging children to disrespect their parents. It is not about convincing people to cut family members out of their lives. There is no handbook that arrives with a newborn. Parenting is one of the most difficult responsibilities a human being will ever have. Parents make decisions while they're exhausted, afraid, financially stressed, grieving, working multiple jobs, managing marriages, navigating divorces, worrying about bills, and trying to raise decent human beings with the knowledge they have at that moment. Many parents sacrificed tremendously for their children. Many loved deeply. Many truly did the best they knew how to do. Both of those things can be true. At the very same time, it can also be true that some of the ways they parented caused pain that followed their children into adulthood. Those truths don't compete with one another, they coexist. One of the most interesting things about being human is that we don't enter the world knowing what's healthy. We learn what's normal. Think about that for a moment. We don't know the difference between healthy and unhealthy when we're children. We know familiar. Whatever happens inside our home becomes our measuring stick for the rest of the world. If laughter filled your home, you assume homes are joyful. If criticism filled your home, criticism begins to feel normal. If affection was abundant, you expect closeness. If silence was used as punishment, silence begins to feel like rejection. Children aren't comparing parenting styles. They're simply surviving the environment they've been given. Psychologists have studied this for decades through what is known as attachment theory. Attachment theory tells us that children are biologically wired to connect with the people who care for them because from the moment we're born, our survival depends on those relationships. A child isn't asking whether their parents are perfect, they're asking something much more basic. Am I safe? Will someone come when I cry? Can I trust the people I love? Those early experiences become the blueprint for how we approach relationships for years to come. A child who feels emotionally safe often develops confidence in themselves and in others. A child who grows up walking on eggshells may become an adult who constantly scans every room for conflict before anyone else notices it. Here's where things become complicated. Children almost never blame their parents for unhealthy environments. Instead, they blame themselves. If a parent constantly criticizes them, they don't think, my parent struggles with emotional regulation. They think, I'm not good enough. If affection is inconsistent, they don't conclude, my parent has difficulty expressing emotion. They conclude, maybe I have to earn love. If they're constantly compared to siblings, they don't think, comparison is unhealthy. They think, maybe I'll never measure up. Those beliefs settle quietly into the heart long before the child has the vocabulary to explain what they're feeling. What's remarkable is how often we carry those beliefs into adulthood without realizing it. The child who always felt responsible for keeping peace in the house grows into the adult who apologizes for things that aren't their fault. The child who was only praised when they achieved becomes the adult who believes their worth depends on productivity. The child whose emotions were dismissed grows into the adult who says, I'm fine, while falling apart inside. The child who learned that conflict was dangerous becomes the adult who avoids difficult conversations, even when those conversations could save a relationship. Sometimes we're living out childhood lessons we never consciously chose. Sociologists often remind us that families are our first social institution. Before school teaches us anything, before employers evaluate us, before friends influence us, our families teach us what relationships look like, what authority looks like, what communication sounds like, and what love feels like. Families are where we first learn how disagreements are handled. Do people yell? Do they shut down? Do they apologize? Do they forgive? Do they pretend nothing happened? Those patterns don't stay inside the walls of our childhood homes. We take them into dating relationships, marriages, friendships, workplaces, churches, and even the way we raise our own children. Have you ever noticed how often we excuse behavior simply because it's familiar? We hear phrases like, "That's just how your father is." You know your mother has always been that way. Your grandmother doesn't mean anything by it. That's just our family. Somewhere along the way, explanation became permission. Understanding someone's behavior is important. It gives us context. But context should never become an excuse for repeated harm. There is a difference between understanding why someone behaves a certain way and believing that everyone else should simply accept it forever. Let's talk about trauma itself, because the word has become part of everyday conversation. Sometimes people use it to describe every disappointment or disagreement, and other times people refuse to use it even when profound emotional harm has occurred. The truth usually lives somewhere in the middle. Trauma isn't simply something frightening that happened to you. It can also be what consistently failed to happen. It can be growing up without emotional safety. It can be never hearing, "I'm proud of you." It can be living in a house where you never knew whether today would be peaceful or chaotic. It can be constantly feeling like your emotions were too much, your questions were disrespectful, or your voice didn't matter. Emotional wounds don't always leave visible scars, but they can influence the way someone experiences relationships for decades. Our brains are remarkable. They are constantly learning how to protect us. If a child grows up in an unpredictable environment, their nervous system adapts to survive. They become highly aware of changes in tone, facial expressions, footsteps in the hallway, the sound of a door closing, or the mood someone walks into the room with. That's not because they're overly sensitive. It's because their brain has learned that paying close attention may help them avoid pain. Then adulthood arrives, and that same person may struggle to relax, may expect rejection before it happens, or may overthink conversations long after they've ended. Sometimes what looks like overreacting is actually a nervous system that spent years preparing for danger. Another fascinating concept in psychology is something called family roles. Families under stress often settle into patterns without anyone realizing it. One child becomes the responsible one who tries to fix everything. Another becomes the rebel who acts out. One becomes invisible because staying quiet feels safer than being noticed. Another becomes the family comedian, using laughter to reduce tension every time conflict arises. These roles aren't assigned in writing. They simply develop over time as children learn how to survive their environment. What's amazing is how many adults are still living in those roles decades later. The responsible child becomes the adult who carries everyone else's burdens. The invisible child becomes the adult who struggles to express their needs. The family peacemaker becomes exhausted from trying to keep everyone happy while forgetting themselves in the process. Here's something I think we should all sit with for a moment. Normal isn't always healthy. Just because something happened every day doesn't mean it was good for us. Just because everyone in the family accepted it doesn't mean it should have been accepted. Every family has traditions worth preserving. Every family also has patterns worth questioning. Wisdom is learning the difference. I also want to challenge something that many of us have probably said without thinking. We often tell people, "That made you stronger." Maybe it did. But strength should never be the standard by which we justify unnecessary suffering. People can become resilient after hardship, but that doesn't mean the hardship was healthy. Someone who survives a hurricane may become stronger, but we wouldn't wish hurricanes on people simply because resilience can follow. We should stop confusing survival with health. There is a difference between surviving something and never having needed to survive it in the first place. As we continue this conversation, I want you to think about your own story, not with judgment, not with shame, but with curiosity. What messages about love did you receive growing up? What did conflict look like in your home? Were apologies common, or were difficult conversations simply swept under the rug? Did you feel emotionally safe expressing disappointment, sadness, fear, or anger? Were you allowed to have feelings, or were certain emotions labeled disrespectful? Sometimes the questions we avoid asking ourselves are the very questions that begin our healing. Healing starts with awareness. We cannot change what we refuse to acknowledge. We cannot improve relationships if we're unwilling to examine them honestly. That honesty doesn't require us to hate our families. It doesn't require us to erase the good memories. It simply asks us to recognize that love and hurt can exist in the same relationship, and acknowledging one doesn't erase the other. Sometimes the greatest act of love isn't pretending everything was perfect. Sometimes it's having the courage to say, we loved each other, and there are still things we need to heal. One of the most common statements we hear throughout our lives is, you only get one mother, or you only get one father. On the surface, those statements are absolutely true. There is only one person who gave you life, one woman who carried you into this world, one man who helped create you. That reality deserves acknowledgement. But somewhere along the way, those statements began serving another purpose. They stopped being reminders of gratitude and started becoming conversation stoppers. Instead of encouraging healing, they sometimes discouraged honesty. Instead of inviting accountability, they became shields against it. How many times has someone tried to explain the pain they experienced growing up only to hear, that's still your mama, or that's your daddy? You have to respect them. Respect is important. Honor is important. Gratitude is important. But should any of those things require silence when someone has been hurt? That's the question I want us to wrestle with today. Because if we can encourage people to tell a friend they hurt them, tell a spouse they hurt them, tell a coworker they hurt them, tell a neighbor they hurt them, why does the conversation suddenly become off limits when the person who caused the pain is a parent? Now, before anyone misunderstands where this conversation is going, let me say this as clearly as I can. This is not permission to become disrespectful. This is not permission to weaponize therapy language. This is not permission to blame your parents for every difficulty you've experienced as an adult. Personal responsibility doesn't disappear because childhood was difficult. At some point, every one of us becomes responsible for our own healing. But responsibility for healing should never erase honesty about where some of the wounds began. Those are two completely different conversations. One asks, what happened to me? The other asks, what am I going to do about it? Healthy people eventually ask both. I also want to speak directly to parents because I know many of you are listening. Some of you may already feel defensive, wondering if this conversation is about blaming you for everything that went wrong. It isn't. In fact, I want to acknowledge something that doesn't get said nearly enough. Parenting has always been hard. Every generation has faced challenges that the next generation can barely imagine. Some parents raised children during wars, others raised children during economic recessions. Some worked 12-hour shifts just to keep food on the table. Some were single parents trying to be both mother and father at the same time. Some were grieving the loss of loved ones while still packing lunches, attending school events, paying bills, and trying to make birthdays feel special. Some parents struggled with depression before people openly discussed mental health. Some battled anxiety without knowing what anxiety even was. Others were carrying childhood trauma they had never spoken about because in their generation, therapy wasn't common and emotions were considered weaknesses. Many of our parents weren't raising children from a place of healing. They were raising children from a place of survival. Think about that for a moment. Imagine trying to teach emotional regulation when no one ever taught you emotional regulation. Imagine trying to communicate peacefully when every disagreement you witnessed growing up ended in yelling, silence, or violence. Imagine trying to build confidence in your children when no one ever built confidence in you. Many parents simply repeated what had been modeled for them because they believed that was what parenting looked like. They weren't necessarily asking, is this healthy? They were asking, is this normal? Those are very different questions. This is what psychologists refer to as intergenerational trauma. Trauma doesn't always arrive with dramatic events. Sometimes it travels quietly through habits, beliefs, fears, communication styles, and emotional patterns. A grandfather who believed boys should never cry may have taught his son to suppress every emotion except anger. That son grows into a father who loves his children deeply but doesn't know how to comfort them emotionally because no one ever comforted him. A mother who grew up hearing constant criticism may unknowingly become overly critical because she mistakes criticism for preparation. She believes she's making her child stronger because that's what she was told growing up. The intention may be love, but the impact can still leave wounds. Understanding where a behavior comes from doesn't erase the effect it has on the person receiving it. One of the greatest myths we tell ourselves is that if someone had good intentions, the outcome shouldn't matter. But life doesn't work that way. A parent can intend to motivate their child and accidentally teach them that love is conditional. A parent can intend to protect their child and accidentally become so overprotective that the child grows into an adult who fears independence. A parent can intend to teach respect but use fear so consistently that the child confuses obedience with emotional safety. Intentions matter, but so does impact. Healthy relationships leave room to discuss both. I often wonder what would happen if more parents felt safe enough to say four simple words: I got that wrong. Isn't it interesting that we teach children to apologize, yet many adults struggle to do the same? Somewhere along the journey into adulthood, many people begin believing that admitting mistakes somehow weakens their authority. But I would argue the opposite. One of the strongest parents I have ever met isn't the one who never makes mistakes. It's the one who can sit across from their adult child and say, I didn't know then what I know now. If I hurt you, I want to understand. That conversation doesn't erase the past overnight, but it opens a door that silence keeps locked. And to the adult children listening, I want to challenge you too. Sometimes we spend so much time waiting for the apology that we postpone our own healing. Some parents will apologize. Others may never have the emotional capacity to do so. Some genuinely don't remember events the way their children remember them. Memory is complicated. Perspective is complicated. Pride is complicated. Waiting for someone else to become emotionally available before you allow yourself to heal can keep you emotionally imprisoned for years. Healing isn't dependent on another person's willingness to participate. It's something you choose for yourself, even when someone else refuses to join the journey. Let's also talk about something that many families avoid because it feels uncomfortable: emotional invalidation. Emotional invalidation happens when someone's feelings are dismissed, minimized, mocked, or ignored. It sounds like, you're too sensitive. That didn't happen. You're making a big deal out of nothing. You always exaggerate. You need to get over it. The problem with emotional invalidation is that it teaches children to question their own reality. Instead of learning to trust their emotions, they begin asking themselves whether they're allowed to feel them at all. Over time, that uncertainty can affect relationships, confidence, decision making, and even mental health. Now, let me ask a question that I hope every parent considers, regardless of how old your children are. If your child came to you today and said, something you did years ago still hurts me, what would your first response be? Would you become defensive? Would you immediately begin explaining your intentions? Would you remind them of everything you sacrificed? Or would you become curious? Would you ask, help me understand? There is tremendous power in those three words. Help me understand. They communicate that the relationship is more important than being right. One of the healthiest shifts happening today is that many parents are raising children differently than they were raised. Now, before someone hears that and thinks I'm criticizing previous generations, let me stop you right there. Every generation has tried to improve something for the next one. Our grandparents wanted better opportunities for our parents. Our parents wanted more opportunities for us. Now, many adults are asking not only how can I provide more, but also how can I connect more? They aren't just focused on financial security, they're thinking about emotional security. They're learning that children don't only need food, shelter, and clothing, they also need emotional safety, healthy communication, accountability, affection, and the freedom to express feelings without fear of rejection. Being a different parent doesn't mean your parents failed. Sometimes it simply means you've learned something they never had the opportunity to learn. Knowledge evolves, society evolves, psychology evolves. We know more today about child development, trauma, attachment, and emotional intelligence than we did decades ago. That's not an insult to previous generations, it's simply progress. Just as medicine has improved over time, our understanding of parenting continues to grow. We don't criticize doctors from 100 years ago because they didn't have today's medical technology. We recognize they worked with the information they had. Parents deserve that same grace while also remaining open to learning new ways of connecting with their children. I remember my daughters telling me that they wished I had talked to them about the birds and the bees. When they shared that with me, I had to stop and think. They were right. I hadn't had that conversation with them. Why hadn't I? At first, I couldn't answer the question. It wasn't because I didn't love them. It wasn't because I didn't care. I genuinely couldn't explain why that conversation never happened. But the more I reflected on it, the more I realized something that had never occurred to me before. My parents never had that conversation with me either. Why they didn't, I honestly don't know. Maybe they felt uncomfortable. Maybe they didn't know how. Maybe they assumed someone else would cover it. I can't speak for their reasons because I never asked. Then it hit me. Sometimes we don't just inherit our parents' eye color, their smile, or their mannerisms. Sometimes we inherit their silence. That realization didn't make me angry with my parents, nor did it excuse my own oversight. It simply helped me understand how easily patterns can travel from one generation to the next without anyone intentionally choosing them. It reminded me that some things aren't passed down because they're right. They're passed down because they're familiar. Sometimes we repeat what was modeled for us, and sometimes we repeat what was never modeled for us because we don't even realize something is missing until someone lovingly points it out. For years, I couldn't answer my daughter's question, but in that moment, I realized I wasn't just looking at my parenting, I was looking at my own childhood. What wasn't talked about in my home became something I never thought to talk about in theirs. Not because I didn't love my daughters, but because silence had become normal. When my daughters shared that with me, I had a choice. I could become defensive and remind them of everything I did do as a mother, or I could listen. I chose to listen. Their honesty wasn't an attack on my motherhood, it was an invitation to grow. That's something I hope every parent, including myself, continues to embrace. Our children aren't saying we failed because they point out something they needed. They're trusting us enough to tell us their experience. That's a gift, even when it's uncomfortable to hear. That experience also taught me something else. Breaking generational patterns doesn't always happen in one dramatic moment. Sometimes it begins with one honest conversation. Sometimes it begins with a parent saying, "You're right. I wish I had done that differently." Those words don't erase the past, but they can build a bridge to the future. If we want our children to learn accountability, then perhaps one of the greatest lessons we can teach them is being willing to model it ourselves. Imagine what families could become if we normalized one simple idea. Children should feel emotionally safe telling their parents when they're hurting. Notice I didn't say children should control the household. I didn't say children should disrespect authority. I said emotionally safe. There is a tremendous difference. A child who can respectfully say, "That hurt my feelings," without fearing humiliation, ridicule, or rejection is learning one of the most valuable relationship skills they'll ever possess. They're learning that honesty and love can exist together. They're learning that difficult conversations don't have to end relationships. They're learning that conflict can become connection when both people are willing to listen. Perhaps that's one of the greatest gifts we can give the next generation. Not perfect parents, because they don't exist, but parents who are teachable, children who feel heard, and families that understand love is strengthened by honesty, not threatened by it. Maybe real strength isn't pretending we've never made mistakes. Maybe real strength is having the courage to look across the table at someone we love and say, "Tell me your experience. I may not remember everything the same way, but I care enough about you to listen." Because listening, truly listening, may be where healing finally begins. As we begin coming toward the surface of today's conversation, I want to spend some time talking about one of the most misunderstood words in relationships, and that word is boundaries. The moment someone says they've established boundaries with a parent, a sibling, or another family member, people often jump to conclusions. They assume the person is bitter. They assume they're holding a grudge. They assume therapy has somehow convinced them to abandon their family. But I wonder if we've misunderstood what boundaries actually are. A boundary isn't a punishment. A boundary isn't revenge. A boundary isn't saying, "You don't matter." A healthy boundary is simply communicating what is necessary for a relationship to remain emotionally safe. It isn't about controlling another person. It's about taking responsibility for yourself. I cannot control how you speak to me, but I can decide whether I remain in a conversation where I'm being insulted. I cannot control whether someone chooses to yell, manipulate, criticize, or belittle me, but I can decide that I will no longer participate in interactions that consistently damage my emotional well-being. Boundaries are not walls built to keep people out forever. More often than not, they are gates with expectations attached to them. One of the reasons boundaries feel so uncomfortable is because they often change relationships that have operated the same way for decades. If someone has always expected unlimited access to your time, your emotions, your decisions, or your life, your first boundary may feel like rejection to them, but sometimes what they're actually experiencing isn't rejection at all. They're experiencing a change in a relationship that previously required very little accountability. Healthy relationships adjust. Unhealthy relationships often resist. That doesn't mean the people resisting are evil. It simply means change can be difficult, especially when someone has benefited from things remaining exactly as they've always been. I also want us to normalize something that many people quietly struggle with, and that's guilt. There are people listening today who feel guilty every single time they choose themselves. They feel guilty for saying no. They feel guilty for not answering every phone call. They feel guilty for missing a family gathering because they needed rest. They feel guilty for protecting their peace. Somewhere along the way, many people were taught that love meant unlimited access, that if you truly loved your family, you would tolerate anything. But healthy love has never required the absence of boundaries. In fact, some of the healthiest relationships are healthy because boundaries exist. They create clarity, they create respect, they create predictability, they allow people to remain connected without constantly hurting one another. Now, I want to be very careful here because I also don't believe every disagreement requires distance. We live in a time where words like toxic and trauma are sometimes used so quickly that ordinary conflict gets mistaken for abuse. Every family argues. Every parent loses patience. Every child says things they regret. Every relationship has moments of disappointment. We have to be careful not to confuse imperfection with toxicity. If your mother forgot your birthday one year, that doesn't automatically make her emotionally abusive. If your father disciplined you in ways you didn't like, that doesn't automatically mean he was trying to traumatize you. We have to leave room for ordinary human imperfection. At the same time, we shouldn't minimize repeated patterns of emotional harm simply because no one was physically injured. There is a difference between conflict and chronic mistreatment. There is a difference between making mistakes and refusing accountability. Wisdom is learning to recognize that difference. There may be some people listening today who are asking a question they've been afraid to ask out loud. Is it okay to distance myself from someone I love if the relationship is consistently unhealthy? My answer is one that requires nuance because every situation is different. Distance should never be the first solution simply because relationships become difficult. Healthy relationships require uncomfortable conversations. They require forgiveness. They require patience. They require grace. But there are also situations where every conversation becomes another opportunity for manipulation, humiliation, intimidation, or emotional harm. There are situations where every interaction leaves someone emotionally exhausted, anxious, or questioning their own worth. In those situations, creating distance may not be an act of punishment, it may be an act of preservation. It may be giving yourself the room necessary to heal while also giving the other person the opportunity to reflect. Sometimes distance is temporary, sometimes it's long term, sometimes relationships are restored stronger than before, sometimes they aren't. Every family story is different, and I think we should be careful about judging decisions when we haven't lived someone else's experience. This also brings us to one of the most misunderstood ideas in relationships, and that's forgiveness. Somewhere along the way, forgiveness became confused with reconciliation. People often believe that if you've truly forgiven someone, you should return the relationship to exactly what it was before. But forgiveness and reconciliation are not the same thing. Forgiveness is something that happens within you. It is choosing not to allow resentment to control your future. It is releasing the desire for revenge. It is refusing to let someone else's actions permanently define your peace. Reconciliation, however, requires two willing participants. It requires trust. It requires accountability. It requires change. You can forgive someone who has never apologized. You can forgive someone who never admits they were wrong. You can genuinely wish them well while also recognizing that the relationship as it once existed is no longer healthy. That isn't hatred. That isn't bitterness. Sometimes that's wisdom. I also want to speak to those who have become parents themselves because becoming a parent often changes the way we see our own childhood. Some people develop greater compassion for their parents because they finally understand how difficult parenting really is. Others become more aware of wounds they didn't recognize before because they find themselves saying, I could never imagine speaking to my child that way. Or, now I understand how much I needed emotionally. Both responses are understandable. Becoming a parent doesn't always answer old questions. Sometimes it creates new ones. But one of the beautiful things about parenthood is that every generation has an opportunity to interrupt patterns that no longer serve the family. Every bedtime story read with patience, every apology offered after losing your temper, every conversation where a child feels heard instead of dismissed, every hug freely given, every I'm proud of you, every tell me how you're feeling becomes another brick in the foundation of a healthier legacy. I love the phrase breaking generational cycles, but I also think we should define what it really means. Breaking a cycle doesn't mean becoming perfect. It doesn't mean your children will never need therapy. It doesn't mean your family will never argue or experience hardship. Breaking a cycle means becoming aware of patterns that caused harm and intentionally choosing healthier responses. It means asking yourself difficult questions. Am I parenting from wisdom or am I parenting from fear? Am I disciplining because I'm teaching or because I'm triggered? Am I listening to understand or am I listening to defend myself? Those are questions every parent, every grandparent, every caregiver, and honestly, every human being can benefit from asking. I also want to acknowledge something that doesn't get discussed enough, and that's grief. Sometimes the deepest grief isn't losing someone through death. Sometimes it's grieving the relationship you wished you had but never experienced. Some people grieve a father who was physically present but emotionally unavailable. Some grieve a mother whose love always seemed tied to performance or perfection. Some grieve the childhood they imagined every child was supposed to have. That grief is real, even if the person you're grieving is still alive. Healing sometimes begins when we stop waiting for people to become who they've repeatedly shown us they cannot be, and instead begin accepting what is while deciding what we need moving forward. Now, before we leave the bowl today, I want to challenge every single listener, regardless of whether you're a parent, a grandparent, an adult child, or someone who hopes to have children one day. Ask yourself this question: what am I passing on, not just financially, not just genetically, emotionally? Am I passing on fear or confidence, shame or acceptance, silence or communication, pride or humility, criticism or encouragement? Every interaction we have with the people we love becomes part of someone else's story. The question is, what kind of story are we helping them write? If you're a parent listening today, understand this. Your children don't need you to be perfect. They need you to be present. They need you to be willing to learn. They need to know that your love is bigger than your pride. One sincere apology may accomplish more than 100 explanations. One honest conversation may begin healing that years of silence never could. If you're an adult child listening today, I hope you know this. You are allowed to acknowledge your pain without dishonoring your parents. You are allowed to appreciate their sacrifices while also recognizing the places where you were hurt. You are allowed to build boundaries without building bitterness. You are allowed to seek healing without seeking revenge. You are allowed to become a different parent without condemning the one who raised you. And perhaps most importantly, you are allowed to believe that your story does not have to end where your family's pain began. Maybe that's what healing really looks like. Not pretending the past didn't happen. Not rewriting history to make everyone comfortable. Not assigning heroes and villains, but having the courage to tell the truth with compassion, to offer grace without abandoning accountability, to honor those who came before us while refusing to pass every wound on to those who come after us. Because perhaps the greatest legacy we can leave isn't a house or an inheritance or a family name. Perhaps the greatest legacy we can leave is healthier people. Jules, thank you for trusting me enough to sit in the bowl with me today. I know this conversation may have stirred up emotions, memories, and questions, and that's okay. Sometimes healing begins not with answers, but with the courage to ask better questions. If today's episode spoke to you, don't use it as a weapon against someone else. Use it as a mirror. Ask yourself where you can listen better, love better, apologize better, forgive better, and heal better. Because every one of us, no matter our role in the family, has an opportunity to make tomorrow healthier than yesterday. Thank you for sitting in the bowl with me. Now let's come back to the surface. Until next time, stay classy, stay curious, and stay ever evolving.